Hi, it's Nicole. Today we are talking about Mrs Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I finished reading it for the first time recently. The subject of death struck me, so that's what I'll be talking about today. I'll also read you a few snippets from letters and diary entries by Virginia Woolf about Mrs Dalloway from the point she started writing the novel to revising, receiving reviews, and how she used the money from the sales. The novel is about Mrs Dalloway's life in and out of her house around London on the day she gives a party. The working title was The Hours, which gives a more impersonal perspective. Each hour of the day and time itself is a main character and is the consistent presence throughout the novel. In addition to Mrs Dalloway, we follow multiple characters and see the world from many perspectives. It reminds me of Ulysses by James Joyce a lot. The novel is set over one day. The hour is struck out one by one. It happens around one city, London instead of Dublin. Joyce recreates Dublin in meticulous detail with the help of his aunt. He said something like, if one day Dublin was wiped off the face of the earth, people should be able to rebuild the city by the account of Ulysses. Virginia Woolf puts in a lot of geographical details of London in her novel too. The characters roam about the city, minding their own business, contemplating life, and their paths cross without them realizing they share the space in this novel. I wondered if Woolf was inspired by Ulysses because the novels were published within a few years of each other. Ulysses in 1922, Mrs Dalloway in 1925. Woolf definitely read Ulysses. She gave her opinions at various points, mostly not very positive. She seemed to not have consciously written Mrs Dalloway as a response to Ulysses, but it certainly seems to have left an impression. Throughout the novel, I had a sense that Mrs Dalloway was, on the one hand, comfortable and happy about her life, but on the other hand, there was dissatisfaction and emptiness. There were things missing in her life that are essential to one's purpose and meaning. She said, there was an emptiness about the heart of life. And that sense of dissatisfaction builds up subtly throughout the novel. At various points, I felt that Clarissa Dalloway was going to kill herself or disappear from this world. Let's start at the beginning and then jump to the end. This is the beginning of Mrs Dalloway. Mrs Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. On the first few pages of the novel, Clarissa Dalloway walked through the streets of London to the florist to buy flowers for her party that night. There are plenty of hints of something sad and dark in her mind. It was a beautiful morning. The fresh air reminded her of a house she lived in called Burton when she was young, and the man she loved then called Peter Walsh. She crossed the street, heard Big Ben strike, and reflected on how she loved life in London. She came across an old friend and had a chat. That sent her mind back to Burton and Peter again, and she repeated to herself the reason why she didn't marry him. She watched London go past her, and this is what went through her mind. Did it matter then, she asked herself, walking towards Bond Street. Did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her. Did she resent it, or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely? But that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things, here, there, she survived. Peter survived. Lived in each other. She'd been part, she was positive, of the trees at home, of the house there, ugly, rumbling all to bits and pieces as it was. Part of people she had never met, been laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she had seen the trees lift the mist. but it spread ever so far, her life, herself. But what was she dreaming as she looked into Hatch's shop window? What was she trying to recover? What image of white dawn in the country as she read in the book spread open? Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. That kind of sets the tone. She loved her life, but the thought of death seeped in and flooded her like tides coming in and out. The two lines of verse are particularly interesting. Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. I felt like I vaguely heard of it, but I wasn't sure what it meant, so I searched. It's a song from Cymbeline by Shakespeare, which is sung over dead bodies. There are 4 verses. I'll read out the first one. Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. Thou thy worldly task hast done, home art gone, and ta'en thy wages. Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers come to dust. And the meaning is roughly, now you are dead, you don't need to worry about the beating sun or the harsh winter cold. Your work on this earth is done, everyone comes to dust, the rich and the poor. Then some other books caught her attention, and her thought floated upwards for a while away from death. She thought of the First World War, and she tried to not think of the war. She was glad it was over, finally. She knew herself to be a people pleaser, and it was silly to live a life like that. She wished, oh, if she could have had her life over again. Maybe she could have a different face, personality, and interests. And there's a striking image. But often now, this body she wore. She wore her body like an outfit. But often now, this body she wore. She stopped to look at a Dutch picture. This body, with all its capacities, seemed nothing at all. She had the oddest sense of being herself invisible, unseen, unknown. There be no more marrying, no more having of children now, but only this astonishing and rather solemn progress with the rest of them, up Bond Street. This being Mrs Dalloway. Not even Clarissa anymore. This being Mrs Richard Dalloway. Her soul, Clarissa, who thought of Burton and Peter Walsh often, who loved the days of her youth, wore a body, an exterior of Mrs. Richard Dalloway, walked invisibly unknown up Bond Street with the crowd, and couldn't help thinking about death. Towards the very end of the novel, surrounded by the party, the noises, and the people, Clarissa walked into a small, empty room alone. She parted the curtains. She looked. Oh, but how surprising! In the room opposite, the old lady stared straight at her. She was going to bed. And the sky, it will be a solemn sky, she had thought. It will be a dusky sky, turning away its cheek in beauty. But there it was, ashen, pale, raced over quickly by tapering vast clouds. It was new to her. The wind must have risen. She was going to bed in the room opposite. It was fascinating to watch her, moving about, that old lady, crossing the room, coming to the window. Could she see her? It was fascinating, with people still laughing and shouting in the drawing room, to watch that old woman, quite quietly, going to bed alone. She pulled the blind now. The clock began striking. The young man had killed himself, but she did not pity him, with the clock striking the hour. 1, 2, 3. She did not pity him, with all this going on. There! The old lady had put out her light. The whole house was dark now, with this going on. She repeated, and the words came to her. Fear no more the heat of the sun. She must go back to them. But what an extraordinary night! She felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away while they went on living. The clock was striking. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. But she must go back. She must assemble. She must find Sally and Peter. And she came in from the little room. "But where is Clarissa?" said Peter. "Where is Clarissa?" Did Clarissa see herself in the old lady in the opposite window, going through the motions of life day after day until one day she's old, no more parties, alone and quiet, going to bed in the dark? Then she had felt it only this morning. There was the terror, the overwhelming incapacity, one's parents giving it into one's hands, this life, to be lived to the end, to be walked with serenely. There was in the depths of her heart an awful fear. Did Clarissa see herself in Septimus, the young man whom she had never met, who killed himself? She was glad he had done it, as if she envied him. He didn't have to carry on living anymore. He could fear no more the heat of the sun. Well, she must go back. She repeats to herself, she must go back and carry on living. When Peter asked repeatedly, "Where is Clarissa? Where is Clarissa?" I feared that he would never find her again. That was just my feeling when I read it, but interestingly, according to Wikipedia, Woolf's original plan for her novel called for Clarissa to kill herself during her party. In this original version, Septimus, whom Woolf called Mrs Dalloway's double, did not appear at all. I would love to read the original version and find out what happens. My guess is it happens when Peter asks, "Where is Clarissa?" What happened during the day, I wonder, that triggered the suicide? Has she been discontent since this morning or long before today? I imagine her preparing the party and greeting the guests serenely until the moment she opens the curtain in a small room and sees the old lady opposite, and she just slipped off the window. One thing I love about reading classics is the secondary reading. There are a lot of things available to read around it. For this one, I read Woolf's letters and her diary entries during the months and years when she worked on Mrs Dalloway. They give fascinating insights into her purpose for the novel, her thoughts on her characters, and her work process and methods for writing and revision. I chose 3 sections from her letters and 4 from her diary for you. On 12th of May 1923, she wrote in a letter, "I have had only 4 days writing at my novel," this is Mrs Dalloway, "since I got back. Tomorrow, I say to myself, I shall plunge into the thick of it. But how does one make people talk about everything in the whole of life, so that one's hair stands on end in a drawing room? How can one wait and sharpen dialogue till each sentence tears its way like a harpoon and grapples with the shingles at the bottom of the reader's soul?" That's what she wants to do. Whatever story she's writing, she wants the reader's hair to stand on end as they read, and she wants her dialogues and sentences to tear through the flesh and pierce the reader's soul. A month later, on 19th of June 23, she wrote in her diary, "But now, what do I feel about my writing? This book, that is the Hours, if that's its name. One must write from deep feeling," said Dostoevsky. "And do I? Or do I fabricate with words, loving them as I do? No, I think not. In this book, I have almost too many ideas. I want to give life and death, sanity and insanity. I want to criticize the social system and to show it at work at its most intense." So the key words of the novel, she says, life and death, sanity and insanity. Autumn the same year, on 15th of October 1923, she wrote in her diary thoughts on Mrs. Dalloway as a character and reflected on her way of writing. The doubtful point is, I think, the character of Mrs. Dalloway. It may be too stiff, too glittering and tinsely, but then I can bring innumerable other characters to her support. I wrote the 100th page today. Of course, I've only been feeling my way into it, up till last August anyhow. It took me a year's groping to discover what I call my tunneling process, by which I tell the past by installments as I have need of it. This is my prime discovery so far, and the fact that I've been so long finding it proves, I think, how false Percy Lubbock's doctrine is, that you can do this sort of thing consciously. A year later, she was still working on Mrs. Dalloway. She was in her last lap of the novel on September 7th of September 24. She wrote in her diary, "There I am now, at last, at the party, which is to begin in the kitchen and climb slowly upstairs," if you remember that. It is to be a most complicated, spirited, solid piece, knitting together everything and ending on 3 notes at different stages of the staircase, each saying something to sum up Clarissa. Who shall say these things? Peter, Richard, and Sally Seaton, perhaps, but I don't want to tie myself down to that yet. Now I do think this might be the best of my endings and come off, perhaps. Ending on 3 notes to sum up Clarissa. Honestly, if that is in the final version of the novel, I don't quite remember what they are. 3 months later, she finished writing the novel and now was doing the revision. On 13th of December 24, she wrote in her diary, "I am now galloping over Mrs. Dalloway, retyping it entirely from the start, which is more or less what I did with the Voyage Out. A good method. I believe as thus one works with a wet brush over the whole and joins parts separately composed and gone dry. Really and honestly, I think it the most satisfactory of my novels, but have not read it cold-bloodedly yet. The reviewers will say that it is disjointed because of the mad scenes not connecting with the Dalloway scenes, and I suppose there is some superficial glittery writing. But is it unreal? Is it mere accomplishment? I think not. And as I think I said before, it seems to leave me plunged deep in the richest strata of my mind. I can write and write and write now, the happiest feeling in the world." I like her metaphor for revision, and I like how she was satisfied with her work, but at the same time was able to expect negative reviews coolly. And it's just lovely to read. I can write and write and write now, the happiest feeling in the world. If you ask me what's the one thing that gives me the happiest feeling in the world, I'm not sure I'll be able to answer you. The novel was published on the 14th of May 1925. She wrote this letter 1 month after the publication, on the 14th of June 1925. It talks about the different and opposite opinions her novel generated among her contemporaries and her response to them, as well as her response to modernism, which I find very interesting. She wrote, "Dear Gerald, it was very good of you to write, but I shan't answer your criticism, and I dare say you don't want me to, because at the moment I can only pit them against other people's criticisms, and cannot make them refer to Mrs. Dalloway itself. This is partly, I suppose, that I have just had a long talk with Roger Fry, and he gave me an entirely different view of Mrs. Dalloway from yours. In fact, I think you and he contradict each other on practically every point of importance. The two I now remember being Septimus to him the most essential part of Mrs Dalloway, and this I certainly did mean, that Septimus and Mrs Dalloway should be entirely dependent upon each other. If, as you say, he has no function in the book, then of course it is a failure. And fate. No book to him more full of fate. Meanwhile, as I finished it 8 months ago, and I'm now at work on something different, she was writing to the lighthouse at this point, I feel very far away, and as if I saw you and Roger turning a little wax model this way and that, something that I have at the moment very little connection with. Perhaps it is this lack of criticism, or rather the fact that I affect different people so differently, that makes it so difficult for me to write a good book. I always feel that nobody, except perhaps Morgan Foster, lays hold of things I have done. They meet in conflict up in the air, and so I have to create the whole thing afresh for myself each time. Probably all writers now are in the same boat. It is the penalty we pay for breaking with tradition, and the solitude makes the writing more exciting, though the being read less so. One ought to sink to the bottom of the sea, probably, and live alone with one's words. But this is not quite sincere, for it is a great stimulus to be discussed and praised and blamed. I shall keep your letter and read it very carefully in a few months' time. At the moment, I'm letting the different opinions. Here are 2 letters from highly intelligent people. One to say that Mrs Dalloway herself is a failure, and the whole interest centering in Septimus and Razia. Another imploring me to write more like Chekhov, and lamenting the fact that I contemplate the lives of the idle rich. I say I'm letting these opinions accumulate, and then, when all is quiet, I shall creep out of my hole and piece them together. Yours, Virginia Woolf. A year later, on 17th of February 26, she wrote to Vita Sackville West. Dearest Vita, we are having 2 water closets made. One paid for by Mrs Dalloway, the other by the common reader, both dedicated to you. I presume she meant the novels, not the toilets. One thing I noticed from all the diary entries and letters was that she didn't mention the original plan at all, where Clarissa kills herself and Septimus does not exist. I find that very interesting. There are a lot of things to discuss. For example, I only chose a few letters and diary entries to read to you. For example, the version of Mrs Dalloway on Gutenberg has small differences from the vintage classics version I have. I wonder why that is. And the motif of the window in the novel is very interesting. To end, I found this very lovely line in her diary. On Monday the 6th of August 1923, she wrote, I have ruined my morning's work by making bread and buns, which require constant voyages to the kitchen. Even the hard-working Virginia Woolf gets distracted sometimes by baking in the kitchen. I didn't feel like she's a very domestic creature, which makes this even more lovely to read. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one.